Today we will be discussing a new lecture on the public policy theory, that is pluralism. So, in case of pluralism, we will try to understand what exactly this theory of pluralism in public policy, and then we will be also understanding a new concept in pluralism, that is known as hyper-pluralism, followed by what are the features of pluralism, what are the criticism, and then we will be drawing a comparison between the pluralism and elitism, because both pluralism and elitism are the power theories. So, let us discuss about the pluralism. Before understanding this pluralism, we must understand that in case of elitism, there is a concentration of power. But in case of pluralism, of course, since it is the opposite, but it is again a power theory. So, that is the reason it is focusing on concentration, on decentralization of power. So, its focus is decentralization of power. That means instead of following a strict top-down hierarchy, which is following rules or decision making across the different competing groups. So, that is the reason we are thinking about hierarchical decentralization of power instead of concentration of power. And the second aspect of pluralism can be understood in terms of equitable representation. In case of elite theory, we are finding that representation in power is very centered, right? But in case of pluralism, we try to find an alternative feature in power. So, that is equitable distribution rather than a concentrated position, right? And while doing so, of course, there is an emphasis on the coalition, right, rather than thinking about a solo model, or what you can say, the concentration of power by a single body or a single institution. So, we can think about that pluralism in these ways, that how decentralization has happened in a hierarchical structure, distributing power to everyone who are concerned. So, taking this understanding that what would be the pluralism, because we have already understood what is elitism. So, based on this understanding, now we can define what is the pluralist theory. The pluralist theory is described as a general theory, a general type of government where we can find participation by everyone, and this everyone would be having equal status. So, equal status in almost in all the respects, like equal status in possession, equal status in rights, equal status in power, right? And if you see the contributors of this pluralism, so we can think of the writers like Robert A. Dahl and Seymour Lipset. So, they primarily contributed to the thinking of pluralism and theory of pluralism, and this pluralism appeals to the general masses and underprivileged, because by following a decentralized version of power, they try to promote that how all the members of the society can be given power, or they would be feeling empowered. So, based on this understanding, the core feature from the pluralist theory we can draw. The first one would be the decentralization of power. The second one would be the equitable distribution of power, possession and right. And the third could be that there is an emphasis on coalition of all the actors rather than the concentration and representation of power. Okay. Based on this understanding, we can think about a consolidated control, because we are emphasizing on decentralized society in the pluralism theory. So, that is the reason we are thinking about a consolidated control among the rather than taking a consolidated control among the distant and traditional elites. This theory empowers the very marginalized sections of the society or interest group, and they try to promote participation from these marginalized sections and also the interest groups in the democratic process. Okay. And here the ideal is that there should be a equity in all these respects that I told you, be it power, possession or rights. And not only that, pluralist theory is emphasizing on decentralization of power, possession and rights, but also this theory involves a stress on immaterial power, not necessarily the material power, but also immaterial power like ideology, right? Or you can think about ideals such as political ideology, religious ideology, or about even persuasive power. So everything can be under this immaterial power, and the pluralist theory also involves or gives emphasis on this immaterial power as well. And this particular theory is emphasizing that the power should be distributed among all the members of the society through the social contract. So what is this social contract? The social contract is the given rules and regulations, or you can say who should be given responsibility or who should be given some benefit, what should be the guideline for following a particular norm or particular practice. So all these are the part of the social contract. Okay. And as per this theory, when power is distributed among all these members of the social contract, so no member is having more or less power in the institutions in comparison to the other members. So you can think about this pluralist theory in this way, that it suggests no one should control the social contract because everyone has equal stake in it. So that is the reason pluralism theory is best as if everyone is having equal right. But however, we are finding that from the very features, so it appears that pluralism is the best version, especially in democratic societies. But however, we are finding that there are some core tensions. So what are the core tensions? So many times we perceive that this pluralism is found to be the ideal in case of empowering the people, and also it is very, what you can say, it follows a liberal approach, right, in distributing the power among all. But in reality, in practical life, it can be the opposite. That means sometimes it creates a very messy kind of situations. So that is the reason theorists, they argue that in unbalanced societies, powerful and well-funded organization would be there, and in case in the presence of powerful and well-funded organizations, sometimes they try to drown out the needs of truly underprivileged groups or institutions, creating a situation that can be in a very different mode, or which could be the highest degree of pluralism, or which could be having a negative impact in the name of pluralism, which is called as the hyper-pluralism. So what exactly is the hyper-pluralism in this case? That it can be treated as a weakness of the pluralism, because it happens when the pluralist society feels as if it doesn't give the people enough power for taking a decision. So that is the reason they will be revolting, they will be rising up against the government, and as a result what will be happening, they will try to completely cripple down the government. So as a result, when you say that there is a complete crippling of the government is happening, so the government would be bent down to safeguard the will and interest of the interest groups. So that is the consequences of hyper-pluralism, which is not expected, because after all the government is crippled and the government is bent down to the interest of this interest group. So you can find this picture that how everyone tries to control the government and creating a parallel crippling situation. So that is the reason the government will not be able to function. So if the government will not be able to function, so what about the public policies and decision making? So that is the reason, although pluralism is said to be having a lot of positive features, the hyper-pluralism is said to be the weakest form or weakness of the pluralism. So given this understanding, now we can identify what could be the features of pluralism. Okay, so the first thing that we can identify is that the power is highly fragmented here and also highly dispersed. So that is the reason the pluralism state try to decentralize the power as much as it can by creating pressure groups, interest groups, subgroups, and there would be existence of classes, there would be existence of different types of political parties, there would be status groups, there would be interest groups, there would be pressure groups as well, and the existence of all these groups testify the distribution of power, that how power is not concentrated in the hands of a few or a single, rather than it is highly dispersed and highly fragmented. So in this context, since we discussed about that there could be multiple groups in the case of pluralism, So, some of the concept that needs to be understood here is status group, interest group and pressure group. Although we know what are the political parties and what are the existence of classes, but I think we need to discuss about status group, interest group and pressure group. What are these? How these groups are also a part of our pluralism, and the power is fragmented and the power is on all these groups. So, coming to the first one, that is status group. So, what is the status group? The status group is a group or a people in the community, or you can say communities of people who share a common lifestyle. You can say they have the common social honor or privileges as well. So, they are having equal status, equal prestige, and then we can say that those communities or those group of people, since they have equal status, so they are treated as the status group. Okay. So, the status groups are based on a common practice of culture or common level of education, or you can say hereditary factors also. So, based on these components, the status groups are created. And coming to the second one is the interest groups. So, what are exactly these interest groups? So, these interest groups which are highly organized collection of individuals who share common goals and attitudes and concerns, and also they try to protect and promote those shared interests for the society or for a given interest. And coming to the third one, that is the pressure group. What is this pressure group? So, pressure group is a part of interest group. That means it is a highly active subset of interest group that specifically try to influence the government policy or legislations or even administrative decisions. So, you can think about the examples like labor unions, how they fight for increasing labor wage, okay, or there is something, if there is something happening which is anti to the or which is against the labor or particular sections of the labor activities or labor, then they stand and take a common decision or common protective activities and attitude to safeguard their interest. So, you can think about also the case of environmental activists, right? Like you can think about the activists like Narmada Bachao. So, that means these groups or these persons, they try to safeguard Narmada, right, a river, because of some of the negative features that is being created by people or some group of people, and that is the reason these people, they try to safeguard the interest of the river. So, given this understanding, now we can think about what is the comparison between these three, that is status group, interest group and the pressure group. So, basically when you see the status group, it is emphasizing on the question that who you are, because it is based on the social prestige, right, social norms, or you can think about a common lifestyle. So, that is the reason the status group tries to understand or tries to question on this particular question, who you are, right, symbolizing the status of that particular group. But in case of interest group, you can think about a question that what you wish to do or what you want. So, what you want means it is a shared interest rather than the vested interest. Okay. And coming to the last one, that is the pressure group. So, here we try to question that how you achieve that goal or how you get that goal through political influence or through policy change. So, all these are the examples of the different groups in case of pluralist society, and they try to influence the policy as well. So, in this context we can think about that since we are thinking about multiple groups, so these groups provide more effective means of representations, even more representation in comparison to elections, because see, we have different groups like political parties, so there would be representations from status group, there would be representation from interest group, there would be also representation, and from pressure group there are different kinds of pressure groups depending upon the interest. Okay. So, as a result we can find multiple of groups, and these multiple of groups provide effective means of representation, even better representation than election itself. Okay. So, as a result, since we have different groups and they also provide representation and which is more powerful than the election itself. So we can think about the policy, public policy. So, what would be the impact of the existence of all this group on the public policy? Then of course, we can think about the public policy would be the outcome of the group forces, and they would be sometime they would be acting against each other, or they would be negotiating and they would be debating. As a result, the public policy would be fine tuned or policed, or you can say that public policy can also change in this situation, since there would be different forces of groups and they would be trying to act against each other as well. And in this pluralism case, since there are different groups but no single group will dominate for every group, and there will be equal and opposite power for every group. So, since there will be equal and opposite, that means there is hierarchy of groups or there is hierarchy of powers, and we can find that although every group would be having some power, but it is not necessarily that every group would be having equal amount or equal weightage of power. So, that is the reason we can find that although no single group can dominate, but yes, if the size of the group or larger the group, then we can find it can influence most. So, larger the group, the more influence it will be having on the public policy. So, as a result, since we discuss about that there could be multiple of groups and they will be exercising their power, and their powers are also of different nature and different weight. So, as a result, the public policies would be the product of bargaining and compromise. Okay. And policies will tend to be moderate, and sometimes it would be fair to all, and sometimes we can think about conducive public policy which can lead to stability in the society. And this can happen because there would be push and pull factors, there would be high bargaining among the interest group, and sometimes there could be the compromise in the public policy because of this bargaining power of all these groups. Then you will be thinking about that primarily we are saying that public policies are formulated by the government, right. This is what we discussed in week 1, module 1. But here also, and if you are finding this kind of situations like as per the theorist of pluralism theory, so it appears that the group of people or different groups, they try to influence public policy, try to not only influence, also shape the public policy and public policy formulation. So, then what is the role of the state? So, as per this theory, the role of the state is almost neutral. The state will be acting in a neutral way because the state is neutral between the competing groups, and it will be acting like just a referee between these interest group or multiple of groups, rather than being involved in an active way. Okay. So, now given this understanding, we can move to discuss about the criticism of the pluralist theory. So, what could be the negative aspects or limitations of pluralism that we can find from the very discussions? So, the first thing that we can find that based on its feature, we can find that power is concentrated, right, or power should be concentrated as assumed in the pluralism theory. But what is happening in the real actual world? Power is not dispersed as advocated by the pluralist theory, rather the power sometimes is also concentrated, okay, or power is not dispersed as is advocated by the pluralism theory. So, this is the first one. We will be discussing that how power is not dispersed as advocated by the pluralism theory by taking some example. And the second one, is also the criticism of the pluralism is based on the feature of pluralism that state is neutral, okay. The role of the state is just a kind of referee rather than actively seeking for any kind of policy or controlling the activities, okay. So, rather the state is also not neutral. So, that is what we are finding in the actual world, and this is the criticism of pluralism as well. The third one is also based on the feature of pluralism, that pluralism theory advocates that the society should be equal, or the power among the existing groups are equal. That is the reason it will be trying to create equitable society, okay, or members of the society would be having equal power. But in actual what it is not so. So by giving some example, we will be trying to criticize this theory. So while discussing that, we are drawing the features and comparing with the actual world. In this sense, we can draw a comparison between the two extreme theory under the power theory, that is pluralism and elitism. So what is all about pluralism? So pluralism assumes that power is distributed. So how power is distributed becomes the subject matter of pluralism. So likewise, what is elitism? Elitism is something that speaks about how power is concentrated, right? And in between we are saying that there are limitations of pluralism, and that is the reason we are criticizing it. Okay, we are criticizing at least in 3 fronts that we have discussed. Now we will be discussing some of the examples. Okay. Yes. So since we discuss about pluralism and elitism, one is emphasizing on how the power is distributed and another how power is concentrated. Okay. So that should be giving a complete picture of the society, but it is not. Okay. So both pluralist and elite theory, although they are offering frameworks to understand the society and the policies in the democratic societies, but neither of these theory are perfect to present the complete picture of the democratic society. Okay. So that means we can think that pluralist theory also makes some mistake in seeing all special interest groups are equally powerful and equally influential. Okay. So in an actual society, in an actual national or subnational governments, we are not finding any kind of special interest groups who are having equal power and equal influence in policy making. Okay. And also pluralist theory does a mistake in seeing the government as a neutral referee. Okay. So this is what we have already discussed, that these are the criticism against pluralist theory. Okay. So now we will be taking some example to discuss it at length, that pluralist theory, although it assumes that the government is acting as neutral referee, but while doing so it is committing a mistake. Okay. Why do we say that it is committing a mistake in assuming that the government is not neutral, or government cannot be treated as a neutral referee in case of pluralist theory? Because in actual world we are finding sometimes the government takes the side on behalf of the corporations. Okay. And sometimes it can also happen that indirectly we can find the government is taking or favoring the corporations. And the kind of act or intervention that the government does, it explains so. Or sometimes what is required, right, the government does not take any action, and as a result it can also favor the corporations. Okay. So actually the interventions in a given situations would be required, but the government would not be taking any action or intervention. So as a result it will try to favor the corporations as well. Okay. So for example, you can think about some example. Okay, we can think about some examples. So I am citing a case of the USA, and you can also think about the cases in India as well, because our theory is concentrating on societies, and especially the democratic society, whether these theories are still applicable or we need to rethink about these theories. So any kind of any democratic society can be taken into account, and since USA is one of the dominant democracy in the world, so we can take an example of the USA economy so far this theory is concerned. Okay. So in the USA there are anti-pollution laws and regulations. Okay. But however, you know that what is the strength of these anti-pollution laws and regulations? So they are really very weak. That means implementation part is quite negligible. So that is the reason these anti-pollution laws and regulations are notoriously weak. So now we will be just imagining or thinking about why is it so? the country like USA, which is one of the richest country and most influential country in the world, why it will be having regulations or laws which would be very weak? So, this is because of the influence of major corporations, major companies on the political processes. Okay. So, now be just curious to understand what kind of influence these major corporations can have on the political processes, and that is the reason the anti-pollution laws and regulations are becoming very weak or remaining very weak. So, the studies like Simon 2008 study, we can find that these anti-pollution laws and regulations are deliberately kept as very weak. Okay. Why? Because the corporations are trying to influence the political process and political parties, right, by funding their election campaigns. Okay. So, their campaigns through lobbying and other types of influences, the corporates help ensure that the pollution control laws or anti-pollution laws and regulations should be kept as weak as possible, so that they will be taking maximum benefit out of the lenient or weak laws. And this particular problem was highlighted when in 2010 after an accident. So, the accident was the explosion of an oil rig which was owned by British Petroleum. This is the corporation, one of the very influential corporations, and this is also a major oil and energy company. So, in 2010, British Petroleum spilled tens of thousands of barrels of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, right, and at that point of time there was this became a global news, because it created one of the biggest environmental disaster in the US history by spilling oil in the Gulf of Mexico. So, that is the reason during this time this problem was highlighted, that as the oil was leaking, there are multiple of news reported, and the news report emphasized that the individuals or political action committees associated with British Petroleum had contributed 5 lakhs US dollar to candidates in the 2008 elections. Okay. And moreover, this British Petroleum had spent around $16 million on lobbying in 2009, and the oil and gas industry had spent tens of millions of dollars on lobbying that particular year. So, this is captured in the report by Montopoli in 2010. So, now we can think about the criticisms against the pluralist theory, that how the government cannot be treated as a passive player or as a referee. Okay. And sometimes the government is expected to act, but it is not acting, or sometimes the government is not expected to act, but actually it does take some actions. Okay. So, from these examples we can find that there could be views of the elite theories, right, but these elite theories also painted in a very simple picture. Okay. Why? Because if you believe this, that these examples support the views of elite theories and the theories also paint too simple a picture, they also commit a mistake. What is the mistake they committed? They do a mistake in implying that the ruling class acts as a unified force in protecting its interest, but it is not. Okay. So, many times we are finding that the ruling class, they would not be combined, or they would not be taking unified force in protecting their interest, right. And sometimes what happens, the corporations do oppose each other for competition purposes, for profit purposes, okay, and the government do not always support the ruling class. So, that can also happen, and that is also happening in the real world. So, for this we can take another example, that the government has tried to reduce the tobacco smoking, right, in the USA, and although we know that in this tobacco production companies, there are many influential companies involved in producing tobacco and they are really wealthy, but however the government has tried to reduce the tobacco smoking, okay, in public places, okay. So, in this case the USA, it does not entirely fit the pluralist vision of power, and the society also, and the society neither does it entirely fit the elite vision, right, or we can think about that it completely does not fit to the pluralism version as well. So, that is the reason this is the case that we made, that corporations sometimes do oppose each other for profits, and governments do not always support the ruling class. So, when the government take a stand to reduce the tobacco smoking despite the involvement of large wealthy tobacco companies. Okay. So, likewise we can think about similar examples, that whether these similar examples or similar practice is also, or similar features are being found in case of India. Okay. So, we can think about some of the questions, like there are questions on freebies or populist policy that try to influence the voters in India as well, and most of the government and the maybe it is the national or subnational government. So, many governments in their budget clearly declaring freebies and populist policies just to influence the voters. Okay. For example, we can think about the heavily subsidized electricity, right, be it electricity like electricity pumping machine, or we can think about some of yojanas like PM Kusum yojanas. Okay. So, although we understand that this heavily subsidized electricity is given to the big landholders, and we can think about that it is a pressure on the fiscal health of the state or nation, but it is not decreased. This subsidy amount is not decreased because of the influence of big landholders who are getting subsidized electricity, and they are contributing to the election campaigns. And as a result, the power distribution companies are negatively impacted. Although many times we have already discussed, or the researches are going on, that how a particular policy like this is negatively impacting, but still the beneficiaries, since they are contributing a large amount to the election campaigns or to the political processes, as a result this particular aspect, that is controlling subsidy, is not happening. Okay. And although many researchers have already found that, so because of this subsidized electricity there are environmental impacts. Okay. So, in many states we are finding that there is water scarcity and there is depletion of water as well, but still since subsidized electricity is being provided to the big landholders, so again it is increasing this problem rather than decreasing. Okay. So, for today's lecture you can follow the references, like you can take the references of R.A. Dal, right, we can think about the Mills, okay, and also this one Thompson EP. Okay. And these are some of the online resources that you can also follow. Thank you very much. In the next class, we will be discussing about some other theories in the public policy.